Ooh. Alrighty, it is 10:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. What I'm gonna start with today is just walking y'all through everything on Blackboard so that you're familiar with where to find everything. And then I'll have y'all reintroduce yourselves, just again, because we're gonna be doing a lot of group work and whatnot. And then we will dive into our first lecture. So everything is coming up here. All right. So if you go to our Blackboard page, and I know a lot of you have already been on it, which is awesome. So a bunch of things you can find that'll be helpful. You can always find a copy of the syllabus here. It's called revised because I had to put in at the academic symposium, Courtney. There is the Zoom info if you are sick, something comes up. And then I have just a couple of things so I want to say fall 2020, the faculty were able to do a workshop with the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. At that point in time, they actually had an office on our campus. And these group norms are something they presented to us that I think are really great. So just making sure that when we're talking, one person talks at a time. That's just like common courtesy, right? Using I statements, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this class will dredge stuff up for people, particularly if you have family members who've been involved in the legal system, whether on the lawyer, judge, police officer side, or as someone who's had to go through the legal system. So just talking about how things affect you and not necessarily other people. Maintaining confidentiality. Yeah. Okay, shoot me an email and I can add you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, same for anybody else in here. If anybody else in here does not have this showing up, shoot me an email and I can manually add you. Good. Thank you for bringing that up. Maintaining confidentiality. So if someone does share personal information in here, please don't go and be like, oh my gosh, can you believe what so-and-so said in class? Just be respectful. Practice purity of motive. There are going to be times when people in here, honestly, including me, are going to F things up, right? Out of their own ignorance. For me, it's when we get to Latin terms. I took French, not Latin, so I'm going to butcher them, right? But there are also things that'll be much more personally affronting. We want to start with the assumption, and it's really hard, I fully recognize, particularly if you're in the group that the ignorant comment is directed at, to assume that they're coming at it essentially from a place of ignorance rather than hate. And I will always try to be the one who jumps in and does number 5, if possible, the ouch, then educate, just ooh, I don't know if you realize, but that's something that could be really harmful to say to people. And then educate them why. Sharing the air, and then taking responsibility for how we say things as well as what we say. I also have VWU's non-discrimination statement here, just because I think that's helpful for all of us for reference. And we have essentially, we recognize all the typical protected groups, including race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disability, status as a veteran, et cetera, et cetera. And then the lecture notes are here. So I have the PowerPoints both as, no, I just have them as PowerPoints for this one, but if there's extra stuff, sometimes I'll have a JPEG of it, or handouts. I gave y'all the link to the Google Drive that I'm going to be working off during class, just in case I tweak something throughout the semester. You'll be able to see the most updated ones if I forget to update these, which again, full disclosure, I'm human, I might. Then here is where you can find our lecture recordings. I already posted the one from Tuesday where I'm talking about the syllabus. So throughout the semester, they will all populate here, and you'll be able to find it by the date of class you want to review or that you might have missed. And that's my very exciting YouTube channel. I believe I have 70 followers. Woohoo. I'm an influencer. I do have people who are not my students watch my videos. And I'm like, why? But okay. And then here is where you will turn in all of the little assignments for the service learning project, as well as the bigger papers. And here are some of the previous sites people have volunteered at to get you ideas going. And then some other forensic psychology organizations in the area that, could help steer you in the right direction, perhaps. But I'm also willing to that's one of the reasons why having you all turn in your plan, because if you're I really want to work with survivors of human trafficking, I can be oh, the Virginia Beach Justice Initiative, right? So I have connections to some of these things. Okay, Cool, yeah, so shoot me an email. And they're great, so. And then take home exams, again, I will update these and actually put up the exam hopefully within the next couple weeks, so you'll have plenty of time. But there are a series of short answers essentially related to the big topics that we talk about. So you turn them in, by the due date, but you can kind of do them at any point in the semester. Some of the stuff is just the standard stuff that Blackboard always has. We're not really going to be using the discussion boards or the groups, but it's there. I think y'all probably know by now, this is where you'll find your grades throughout the semester. And for things like, oh, the interview paper, how is Dr. Myers going to grade that? I've made it so y'all can view the rubric. And so it's real easy to be like, did I cover everything she's going to be grading? Already questions about Blackboard, where to find stuff, any of that good stuff. I try to make it as clear as possible, but sometimes I feel like just because of technology, it's clear as mud. So, alrighty, so I think pretty much everybody is here. So what I want you to do is just go around and say first and last name again so that I can take attendance, hopefully over the course of the next week or two. I'll be able to just check y'all off as you go in. I know about, I think like a third of you already. So hopefully my little, those of you who've had me before have heard this. I'm really bad with names. This is like a personal character trait that I have a flaw with. Every semester, I usually get two people mixed up. They often look nothing alike. Sometimes they're different races, but I just like decide someone's name is that name and that one. It's bad. So I'll often be cautious if I don't know your name yet. I'll just be like, yeah, instead of being like, so and so, go ahead. So just go around and all you have to do is say first and last name. There we go. Awesome. Gotta make sure, because like I said, this is my first ever to Trinity. And Trinity, this is kind of a weird quirk of this class. You're actually the first alphabetically. I don't know if anyone before F. It's interesting. Right? Awesome. Okay. Righty. So I always get really warm when I'm teaching. If any of you get too cold with this wind blowing, please let me know. Go ahead. You want to say it so everybody else gets to know you. Awesome. All right, thank y'all. And again, hopefully within the next week or two, I won't even have to call roll next week. I'll pull it. And then hopefully I'll just be able to check y'all off if you come in and then it doesn't disrupt anything. So. Alrighty, so I am going to pull up my lecture here and a couple quick things. First, I'm going to have it not show the captions because the ones on Google are so much better. So there we go. And I include the captions for a couple different reasons. One is if anyone does have to zoom in, sometimes it's really hard to hear what I'm saying through the computer, depending on quality of sound on your end. And honestly, my end, God knows what these computers do sometimes. And then the other reason is to make it more accessible. I know that sometimes people have hearing impairments, and it can be really hard to understand what I'm saying if you can't lip read. So this is something that I learned how to do during the pandemic, and I'm very glad because I think it'll just help with accessibility issues in general. Now, one thing I should tell you all about this class is when I first taught this class, I actually didn't use PowerPoints. I like wrote stuff on the board and things along those lines. And basically everybody hated it. They were like, Dr. Myers, just do PowerPoint. And then of course, when I do PowerPoints, I get like, I don't like that you do PowerPoint. So I just did this mostly because my handwriting's hard to read. I think that's why people hated when I wrote on the board. So we're gonna roll with that. And so just from what you know, what you've seen in media, what you may have read before for other classes, how do you think psychology and psychologists become involved in the legal system? Again, the wrong answer. Yeah, Julia.
They even heard of that, like the reasons why somebody carried out a crime or fatigue and I
Exactly. Yeah. And that carries over into a whole bunch of different things. So not guilty by reason of insanity, are very rarely actually used. You would never know from media, right? But a very rarely actually used defense. And then also you can figure out whether someone is competent to stand trial. Are they with it enough to actually understand what's going on? We also can get involved during civil proceedings to assess stuff. So for example, assessing pretty much everybody who could possibly get child custody during those types of disputes. The mother, the father, the grandparents, whoever, probably the child as well. People that I've talked to who do those say those are like the hardest evals to do because sometimes there's no good answer, right? But also maybe civil suits. If someone is arguing, I have a psychological condition, I have PTSD because of something that happened to me at work, say, just like if you had whiplash or a broken leg, we need medical documentation to back that up, right? That's one of the reasons I'm wearing my mental health is health shirt today. I think psychologists, we're talking about this in this chapter, psychologists have fought pretty hard to get our expertise recognized and sort of acknowledge that mental health should be looked at from an expert perspective if those issues are raised within court. Yeah, was there some other ways people think that we might get involved? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So within the prison system, usually there's some access to mental health care. Different prisons are better than others. So for example, it was last semester I read an article where the city of Norfolk's jail system had one psychiatrist who was working 7 hours a week for all their prisoners. Yeah, exactly. Some of your eyes are exactly, and like they quit because they were like, I can't ethically provide good care under these circumstances. Now, I haven't seen any follow-ups. Who knows if there's just not care or take out somebody else to do the 7 hours a week. But other places have really comprehensive mental health care when you're behind bars. The other place we might work is, so let's say you are found not guilty by reason of insanity. They don't just like let you go run around on the streets, right? You go into a forensic mental health setting. And so psychologists might work in those settings as well. And some of those people stay in there their whole lives.
Yeah, what about when questioning people who are detained for like violent crimes?
Yeah, so some of the things we might do are like risk assessments, basically. Is this person a risk to themselves or others if we let them out on bail, for example? And oftentimes that might not be assessed right away, right? Usually that's sort of up to the judge, but sometimes they'll ask a psychologist to come in at that point, especially if there's clearly some mental health related issues going on. So for example, one of the cases we'll talk a little more about later in the semester is the Andrea Yates case. I don't know if people are familiar with this. For some of you might have been really young when it happened. But this is a woman who drowned all her children. And what it turned out, which I don't even think people necessarily realize when the media coverage is going on, is that she had postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. And the last baby she'd had, like the second to last baby she'd had, her doctor had said, you should get your tubes tied. This isn't safe for you or for anybody else. And her husband was from this like fundamentalist religion where he was like, no, that's not God's way. And then unfortunately she had another baby and that happened. So yeah, so we might be involved in assessing at that point in time, like, is this person, should we even ponder letting this person go back out? Yeah, any other ideas? What is the biggest way we see psychologists portrayed like on TV, like crime shows? Yeah, on trial, they're testifying, right? They might be criminal profilers, and so we'll talk about all those as well. And one thing, maybe I should get this out of the way early in the semester. I hate to like start with a like disappointment. A lot of people want to be profilers, and I'll just let you know there aren't a ton of jobs for that. So throughout the semester, if you're thinking, I want to be in psych and the law, keep your mind open to these other professions we'll be talking about, because some of them, there's a lot more availability. So for example, if you get interested in doing something like child custody evals, every municipality needs people to do that, right? Whereas like for criminal profilers, like the FBI hires a few, and like really rich local departments might hire one or two, but like those jobs are much less. Alrighty, so a term that you might hear me use a lot is forensic psychology. And in fact, a course on psychology in the law is sometimes called a forensic psychology course. And the term forensic actually translates to forum. And this is from the Latin. It is a Latin word I can pronounce, obviously. And it refers to where the Romans held their trials. So trials, forensic, forum, moving along those lines. So the current meeting, and this is within any sort of academic discipline, is, so you can have forensic chemistry, right? Things along those lines, forensic biology. Is that it is the relationship between a professional field and the legal system. So a relationship between the professional field and the legal system. Other examples are like forensic medicine or forensic anthropology. So Bones, she's a forensic anthropologist. So obviously based on that definition, this is the intersection of psychology with the legal system. And it's like most things, defined a little bit differently depending on who you ask. So the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists, they define it, and this is a set of ethical guideposts for people who are going to practice in this area. Describe it, you don't have to write all this down, but a field that covers all forms of professional conduct when acting with definable foreknowledge as a psychological expert on explicitly psychological issues and direct assistance to the courts, parties to legal proceedings, correctional and mental health, forensic mental health facilities, and administrative, judicial, and legislative agencies acting in a judicial capacity. So for me, the part that stands out is with definable foreknowledge. There will be times, let's say if you're a clinical psychologist, where your client ends up being part of a legal case, right? And because of that, you might get your notes subpoenaed, and there are laws and ethics related to that. But practicing, that's not practicing forensic psychology, right? Practicing forensic psychology is sort of like knowingly going in saying, this is what I'm going to do. Yeah.
Does that not mean okay?
That is where some of these issues come into play. So if your client signs a consent, then you can release it. Otherwise, psychologists will often try to argue it does breach confidentiality. But basically what I've been taught, what I've heard from people in the field is like, if they won't let up, you have to, and you try to get your client's consent to release it. Because otherwise you can get, you basically get held in contempt of court, essentially.
So that like trumps like that.
Yeah, now there are ways to kind of get around this. And so a lot of psychologists who are in practice will use what they call a shadow file. So especially now, most records are electronic. And so what they put in the electronic or the main record, the thing that would be subpoenaed, might be helpful, but less detailed. And then they keep a file for themselves with actual notes from therapy that won't go into the sort of that permanent file. And so that's a way where you can like comply, but also keep some stuff confidential. Yeah, and this does get tricky. So for example, I worked as our assistant director for our training clinic, my 5th year of grad school. And one of the things I did was manage our record system. And we had someone from the government contact us. This person had signed a consent. They were applying for a job within the federal government. Not sure what, I'm guessing something in intelligence, because they didn't tell me. It's like, that's a need to know. And so this person they didn't ask to see the records, but they asked me questions about this person I'd never treated. So I had to pull their file, look through things, and answer their questions. Like, it was essentially like, do you think there's anything that would like get in the way of them doing this job? And I said, no. This person was being treated for depression. They were actually being treated, I think they were being treated in the 90s, and they were, it was a gay man. And so he was dealing with a lot of like identity issues and things. And they didn't ask me anything related to his sexuality, so I didn't disclose it. So there are ways that you can comply, but still, keep your client's confidentiality on things that aren't relevant, if that makes sense. Yeah, really good question. The American Board of Professional Psychology, or ABEP, so they are, back up 3 steps here. So when you get a degree in psychology, typically you're either going to get a master's or a PhD. There's also something called a PsyD, which is a doctorate, but you don't do research in psychology. So that focuses entirely on clinical practice. And then once you've gotten that degree, you're not free to just go see clients, even if it's a clinical degree. You have to go through a licensure process. Once you've gone through that licensure process, you don't have to, but you can choose to go through what's called board certification. So if you've ever heard a doctor say, oh, I'm a board certified OBGYN, right? Or I'm a board certified thoracic surgeon. This is a similar process, but for psychologists. Again, we're trying to do mental health is health and mimic that. So you can actually get an ABEP board certified in forensic psychology. Yeah.
Are there like certain requirements to be able to take the board certification?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, let me real quick. I don't have it linked, but I can pull up the ABEP site for y'all real quick. Yeah, because I'm not even licensed, I've never even like thought about doing it myself. But I do know that there is, there's like a whole application process. There's an exam. And so like, here are some of the steps in applying. You look at your requirements. So general requirements, you need your doctorate. You need to have completed an APA certified accredited internship, and you need to be licensed. And right now the ABEP is United States and Canada. And then each specialty will have their own specific requirements. So for example, for forensic psychology, they're going to go and want you to have this, that you need to go through a credential review process, written exam, oral exam, and a vote by the board, and that you haven't like violated ethical issues. I know it sounds silly, but it definitely is something that comes up. And so you can see candidates can go through all of this, and there are fees involved. So just to apply is $125. The exams each have their own fees, right? And so it's an expensive process. And so the people who go through it are really people who like it will benefit them professionally, like especially let's say you are planning, like I'm gonna do a lot of testifying as an expert witness in court. Having board certification gives you more gravitas for that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I know in like medicine every decade, it's like a major exam, like get recertified, your practice, but the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so for psychology, it's actually every 2 years you have to renew your license. You don't have to take an exam, but you do have to, and this is regardless if you're practicing something like clinically, counseling, social work, I think is also similar, forensic, what have you. So you have to show that you've done continuing education during that time period. And so usually it's like X amount of hours about ethics, but then the others can be sort of whatever you're interested in. And so people often get that by going to conferences, doing webinars, things along those lines.
For people who want to be like clinical psychologists at hospitals and stuff, I know they have to do an internship during when you're working in school and stuff. Is it better to get, or does the hospital help, like, do the teaching hospitals help for you to get certified?
Good question. So most people would get board certified like after they're done with school and maybe have been out for a couple of years. I would guess some places of employment would help with funding. Because I myself have never actually tried to do it, I'm not sure. But yeah, my guess is yes, because it brings additional prestige to the institution. It's like, well, this many of our doctors are board certified, right? Yeah, and so like, for example, even for Wesleyan, I'm not licensed or trying to get board certified, but like when I go to conferences, I have like $1,300 a year I can use to go, and so they'll pay like my convention fee, my flight, things like that. Because they recognize that continuing education will help me, help you all, but then also if I'm presenting, that brings additional prestige to the university. So yeah, my guess is yes, just based on that.
So I had another question. But, so for clinical psychologists, can you decide to be both a researcher and a therapist?
Yes, and in fact, a lot of clinical psychology research, I'm actually going to talk about this in my abnormal class this afternoon, sorry, adult psychopathology, we changed the name. Their research is therapy based. So like doing your therapy might actually be part of your research itself. Whether you're trying like a new variation on therapy or just trying to validate. So I'll give you a really good example. So my friend Sherry Levinson, who works at the University of Louisville, she is doing studies on having people like fill out an app every day for 2 weeks, analyzing their data, coming up with a specific model of like which symptoms are most pressing for that particular person, and then just doing therapy to focus on those.
Like better health?
Exactly. Well, this is like you go in and do one-on-one therapy. Yeah. Interestingly, when I looked up BetterHealth when I got clinical psychology last spring, could not actually find any research on it yet. So that makes me feel a little like, we should probably see if this actually works. But that's because I'm a clinical scientist and I think we need to check everything to make sure it works so we're not hurting people. But yeah, so like you might do work. So my work is more on risk factors and prevention. And so it's a little more step back abstract. But yeah, so a lot of clinical psychologists would be doing like actual therapy as part of their studies, but there are also people who do both. There are even people like, so I'm part of at my major organization, a special interest group for clinical psychologists who teach at liberal arts colleges. And not all, but I would say about half of them have their own small private practice. Well, so yeah, I mean, I could do therapy if I wanted. It wasn't good for me to be a therapist mentally. So, I mean, this is something you have to figure out as you explore whatever career you're interested in going into, is like, what cost might that have to you and your mental and physical health? Yeah, great questions. Other questions? Awesome. The only other thing I can tell you about ABEP is the one like intimate experience I've had related to it is I actually participated in an exam once. So one of my grad school professors was on the ABEP board and asked me to talk about one of my clients, pretend I was a supervisee of someone who was getting ABEP certified for, I forget if it was just clinical psych or like cognitive behavioral therapy specifically. And so I just went in and like talked about one of my clients, and this guy just like gave me advice. And I was like, man, I'm teaching now. I don't see this client anymore, but I wish I had like had your advice when I was seeing her. And it was just, and then there were people watching while he did this, essentially to be like, how does he do supervising people that he'd be training? Because that's a really important thing you do as a clinical psychologist, if you are in like a teaching hospital, right, is train the next generation. Yeah. So ABEP says this is the application of the science and profession of law to questions and issues relating to psychology in the legal system. And then the American Board of Forensic Psychology and the American Psychology Law Society, which is a division of the American Psychological Association. They put this statement out together that it's the professional practice by which psychologists within areas of clinical counseling, neuropsychology, and school psychology, when they are engaged regularly as experts and represent themselves as such, in an activity primarily intended to provide professional psychological expertise to the judicial system. So clinical and counseling tend to be somewhat similar. Clinical psychologists are more likely to work in like hospital settings, VAs, things along those lines. Counselors tend to be more likely to work in like some sort of academic setting. School psychologists are going to be in K through 12 schools. And then neuropsychologists are psychologists who work on brain-related dysfunctions. So you could see how, let's say someone has a traumatic brain injury and they're suing, right? A neuropsychologist may become very important for that. And then I want to just give a little shout out to the person who taught me forensic psychology when I was in grad school, and that is Dr. Jack Graham, who actually just passed away about a month ago. So RIP, he was so great. So I was really sad to hear about that. And so he just defined it as activities of mental health professionals as they deal with issues having to do with the law. I like that one. It's simple, it's straightforward. It encompasses everybody who's a mental health professional. So we're not like dividing out, you know, people with PhDs versus masters and yada, yada, yada. So activities of mental health professionals as they deal with issues having to do with the law. So you're doing forensic psychology anytime you're offering services intended to address legal issues. So let's say people just released from prison and you're going to try to like reintegrate them. Anytime you offer opinions or services intended to assist the legal system in resolving issues. So for example, let's say you became an expert witness, right? Then you're serving in that capacity as well. All right, so we're going to do sort of a brief background of how did psychologists get involved in the legal system. So in 1908, a guy named Hugo Musterberg wrote a book called On the Witness Stand and argued that psychologists should be involved in a lot of aspects of the legal system. However, this book that he wrote was 269 pages, but had 0 references. So many people were pretty skeptical of his work and thought his claims were exaggerated. So this was largely ignored or dismissed. But as psychology grew as a field, psychologists were called upon more and more in court. Although because they had a PhD, not an MD, they were often questioned. Which, like, again, taking a quick sidestep is ironic because the label doctor originally applied to people with doctoral degrees, PhDs, JDs, EdDs, what have you, and then was sort of appropriated by the medical profession. They used to be called things like physicians, surgeons, things like that, because they knew of the respect that came with it. So just the idea that we have to like prove we're a doctor when we were the OGs is funny to me. One of the seminal cases in which psychologists really showed we have a lot to contribute was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954. So if you're not familiar with this case, this was the one about segregation in schools. And social science research, in particular research by psychologists Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, was presented in amicus briefs to support negative effects of segregation on the self-image of children. So the Clarks did research where they gave young Black children a black doll and a white doll and said, like, which one is pretty, which one is kind, which one is smart? And the kids were just like always seeing the white doll. And then in Jenkins versus the US in 1962, that was the first time that psychologists were officially recognized as expert witnesses. In 2001, forensic psychology became recognized by the APA as a specialty field. That's when that division was formed within APA, which is so interesting to me because clearly people have been doing this for a really long time. The APA has been around since around 1900, and it took until that, I mean, what is that, only like 20 years ago to get it recognized. It's a little absurd. And it grows in popularity where a lot of like those internships that you do have to do your last year in a PsyD or a PhD, a lot of postdoctoral work is now focusing in this area. So if any of you are in the night section of adult psychopathology, the instructor for that, one of our adjuncts, is applying to internships in like forensic settings and correctional settings. So what do they do? Well, it's going to really depend on sort of what they specialize in. So if they work exclusively as a forensic psychologist full-time, there's a few different ways that they work. So if they are practicing forensic psychology, this is my job, I'm a forensic psychologist, they're often employed by some part of the judicial system and often by the courts themselves, essentially. So they might be hired by family courts to not only do custody evals, but also family counseling if it's mandated, things along those lines. They might be hired by a specific attorney or law firm and held on retainer to deal with psychological issues in their cases. They also might be working for a government agency. So again, as I mentioned, unfortunately, it's not as many as TV shows, but some forensic psychologists do work for the FBI and the CIA. Unfortunately, most people that work within those organizations come more out of a criminal justice or law background. They tend to be attorneys or public safety officials rather than people trained in psychology, although there certainly are, again, a few spots for those folks. And then working in correctional settings. This is something, it's really interesting. When I teach our capstone course in psych, we do a reading about whether correctional and forensic psychology are the same field or not. Like some people say they are, some people say they should be different. So forensic psychology, some people define as the whole process until you enter the prison system. And then correctional would be once you enter the facility. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. We're going to talk about correctional psych within this course as well. However, most people who end up doing some forensic psychology work are not employed full-time as a forensic psychologist. Forensic involvement is often just part of what they do. This is in part because it's considered a newer area of specialization, which again is sort of ironic because people have been doing it for a while, but newly recognized. And in part, sometimes they're doing a different job and get involved with things forensic tangentially. So we'll talk about that. And in part because unless you are hired by like the court system or government agency, part of your issue as a forensic psychologist is who's going to pay you, right, for your work. So in civil suits, you're often paid out of settlements or by insurance companies. Lawyers, incidentally, usually get about 1/3 to 1/2 of settlements, and then the client and you as the forensic psychologist and whoever else worked on the case would get paid out of the rest of it. And then in criminal work, it really depends on how you get involved. You can be hired by the court and then paid out of public funds, and then you work for the court, the prosecution. You could be paid by the defense attorney, kind of do this on the side. Then the defense attorney would get the money from the client, or they may be a public defender, in which case they're paid by the county, the city, what have you. So this is something that like can complicate things a little bit of just like making sure, how am I going to eat, right, if I need to do this work. But typically, when you are paid, you're paid pretty darn well. When I was taking this course, I want to say in 2006, At that time, forensic psychologists, particularly those who were expert witnesses, could charge $500 an hour for their time. So I'm sure that's gone up since then with inflation and whatnot. So psychologists can take on a lot of different roles within the legal system. And for each of these roles, there are ethical standards of behavior. And so each of these is going to get its own slide, and we're going to break it down in a lot more detail. And your book also touches on these if you want to read about them a little more. So the basic scientist, we're basically someone who's kind of like me. I'm essentially a basic scientist in the research I do, although it's not forensically related. So they study a phenomenon for the satisfaction of understanding it. That's sort of surface. It's really usually to try to make some positive changes based on knowledge gained. So like my end goal with my research is eventually to find like a really effective prevention program so that people never get eating disorders. That's a pipe dream, right? But at least we can prevent some of them. So they don't necessarily seek to apply their research fundings, but the idea is maybe someone else would apply them down the road. But often their results can address important legal issues. So basic studies of adolescent brain development may be relevant to decisions about, is this person going to be tried as a juvenile or an adult, right? And how much control did they have or know-how did they have when they were deciding whether or not to commit a crime? Just related to that, the human brain isn't fully developed until you're about 25. And the last part of the brain that develops is right here behind your forehead, the prefrontal cortex. And that's where all the stuff like impulse control and emotions are. So when people are really like, oh, why are teenagers like this? It's like literally their brain's not all the way developed. So if any of you have younger siblings, you're like, why do they do this crazy stuff? That's why. It's not an excuse, obviously, but it can explain part of what's going on. They kind of have to work that much harder. A prime example here is the woman I have a picture of up here, Elizabeth Loftus. We're going to talk about her a lot more when we talk about eyewitness testimony. So she does basic research on eyewitness testimony, and as a result is often called on as an expert witness to talk about her research. In terms of ethics of the basic scientists, the concern here is about how they undertake and report their research. So this might seem really obvious, but sadly, it's not always to people, but you can't just make up your data. And you might feel like, who would do that? People. So I'm working on a meta-analysis right now, looking at body image and social comparison. And I did one while I was in grad school, and we're kind of expanding on it and updating it. And one of the articles I cited back then has been retracted because one of the co-authors have made up their data. Data that hits closer to home. Brian Wansink, who is the brother of our very own Craig Wansink, very well-known scientist within food consumption and food-related decisions. Turned out some of his data was fabricated, some of the data practices he used to like chop data in different ways to get the results he wanted were really sketchy. It's really rare for scientific journals to retract an article. There are like a lot of hoops you have to jump through to pull an article and say, this is no longer okay. He's had like 7 or 8 articles retracted. That's really not good.
Like figure out that someone's being.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So sometimes it is, so like in the case of Wansink, it was one of his grad students. Like, and she had like email evidence of him telling her essentially how to like what's called p-hack or just sort of mess with the data to get what you want. But yeah, sometimes it's a lot of the movement within all fields now in science is what's called open science, where in addition to the article, you also like make your data publicly available so people can go back in and analyze it and be like, wait, I didn't find what they found. But yeah, oftentimes it's like a whistleblower, honestly. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, you would think, but not that step. So you do have to do an IRB, which is an institutional review board review before you do it, saying, are you going to do it ethically? But then what you have to get checked is your article where you write up the data. And you choose how you present and what you present and what you don't present there. So there are certainly ways to not present what you don't want, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So like what sort of consequences would a guy like the guy you mentioned face?
He lost his job. He works for Cornell. Yeah, and then, you know, if your publications are retracted. Publications are one of the ways academics get jobs, get tenure. Tenure is the system that lets us essentially have academic freedom, so like. Once you prove yourself and you get tenure, you basically can't be fired unless you do something illegal. And one of the ways they do that is by looking at your publication records. So even if you got a job somewhere else, it might be really hard to get tenure because all those things are pulled, right? Yeah, and so there can be some really severe consequences because of that. And the thing that sucks is like, it can also hit your co-authors who didn't know, who were like trusting you to be ethical, right? Because that's what happened with this article I cited previously, is like, it was one dude who fabricated the data for one of 3 studies in there. And they just trusted him that he had actually collected it, because why would someone do this, right? And so it affects all those too. They're sort of tainted by it. Yeah, so like, yeah, don't do that. Even if you go on to be research scientists, don't make up your data. It's not gonna help science. If it comes back to bite you, it's not gonna help you, right? And it can have very negative consequences. I'll give you the most harmful example I think exists of fabricated data. And that is the original article about autism supposedly or vaccines supposedly causing autism. This was published by a man who wasn't anti-vax. He was working with a competing drug company to develop a new MMR vaccine and wanted to say the existing one was problematic, so theirs would sell more. He took blood samples from kids at his birth, his kids who came to his kid's birthday party. Like that's a party favor. Didn't ask their parents' permission. He also fabricated his data, so he would look at the records of these patients and say, oh yeah, their symptoms started right after they got the vaccine. And when people went back in and double checked it, most of those kids, their symptoms were documented before they even got the vaccine. And in fact, recent research shows that you can start to detect some signs of autism as early as 1 month, which is way before you get any of your vaccines. So that to me is the most harmful article that's been retracted, because people can't get that out of their memory and people still think that vaccines cause autism. Which is so problematic and ableist anyway, right? Because if you're saying, I'd rather my kid not get a life-saving vaccine than have a disability, right? Which if we even want to define people on the autism spectrum as having a disability, I prefer the term neurodivergent. So it's really harmful. Yeah, so scientists should be ethical, right? One would hope. But they're not always. And there are consequences. Wakefield was the name of the guy, I couldn't think of his name, but the MMR vaccine. So we're supposed to report what we find regardless of whether it supports what we want it to support. I can even give a quick example from my own research. So my early research, and I still do some of this sometimes now, was trying to determine whether being a feminist, holding feminist beliefs might be protective against developing an eating disorder. And my thesis showed like, it helps a little, it has like a little buffering effect, but it doesn't actually like totally prevent or protect. And I remember my committee being like, we really wanted this to work. And I was like, I really wanted it to work too. But I can't like go around saying it actually protects, right? Because it doesn't. I can talk about it as a buffering factor. So things along those lines. Yeah, I had a lot more about Wakefield, but we got into him enough. He makes me really mad. There was one time I was still junior faculty. I didn't have tenure, so I probably should have done this, but I just told one of my classes after I talked about it, I was like, vaccinate your goddamn children. Before I even had a kid, I was just like, take care of your kids. Yeah, sometimes even since before I had kids, people who do things to harm children have really upset me. So when we talk about things like pedophilia, that also really upsets me. All right, you can also be what's called an applied scientist. And so here you might be trying to do research that directly will inform the legal system in some way, and you want to put it into practice. So psychologists can be called as two different types of witnesses in a case. So just like anyone else, a psychologist can testify as a fact witness. This would be testify on things they experienced. You know, maybe they witnessed the crime while they were out having dinner or something, right? So they wouldn't be acting in a professional capacity as a psychologist then, they would just be a person, right? Well, what we typically see applied scientists do is to serve as expert witnesses, where they can talk about things they didn't personally experience based on their own work or based on existing research. So applied scientists are dedicated to applying knowledge to solve real life problems. And again, there aren't only applied psychologists, there are applied sociologists, right? Applied anthropologists, things along those lines. And all those people are like, I want to do research that's going to have a pretty immediate impact. So some apply the findings of their professions by serving as an expert witness. And so this is someone who possesses special knowledge about a subject, knowledge that the average juror doesn't have. So if someone's coming in as an expert witness, it is to explain something that your general member of the public would not just instinctively understand. So they can state opinions and conclusions in addition to facts. And expert witnesses can also be asked to directly evaluate the person and then testify about their direct evaluation, or like Elizabeth Loftus does, they can just talk about their area of research and what that shows. So criteria for being an expert witness, you need to be very qualified. And again, this is where having that board certification could be really helpful, because you're like, not only do I have a doctorate, not only am I licensed, but I've been recognized by professionals in my field as being sort of like above and beyond. And when something is beyond the understanding of the average juror, as I was saying, so the judge must be convinced that the testimony that any expert witness, doesn't have to be psychology, could be someone to talk about an electric brake system in a car accident lawsuit, things along those lines. That testimony they will present requires special knowledge, skill, or experience. And that testimony will help promote better decision making. We're not just bringing it in to bring it in. We think that by bringing in an expert witness, it's going to help the jury make that decision in a more knowledgeable way. So psychologists have testified on topics such as employee discrimination, the accuracy of identification by eyewitnesses, and the factors that may cause a suspect to make a false confession. And that's in addition to, you know, again, if you've evaluated the person and you give your expert opinion based on that evaluation. Now, in terms of ethics related to the applied scientist and the expert witness, even though these people are usually hired by one side, if you're an expert witness, you're typically hired by one lawyer or the other. They are responsible for reporting all their conclusions, regardless of whether those favor the side that hired them. So let's say I'm hired to evaluate someone for not guilty by reason of insanity. At the time they committed the crime, they were so out of their mind, they didn't know what they were doing. And I find this person knew exactly what they were doing. I can't lie, so the lawyer likes me more and be like, no, it's fine, exactly what you thought. I have to say, here's what I found, and it's not what you wanted me to find, right? That's part of the ethics of it. And it can be difficult to achieve this objectivity if you're getting a good paycheck. And so people fully acknowledge that, and people who are in those situations really have to be ethically minded. And who actually gets to, oh yeah, all right.
Was it necessary to have you there? As an expert witness if you're in those, I feel
That's a
like
good question. And actually, that's a really good point. So in the large majority of cases, if they're not like these high profile ones, like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case, your everyday run of the mill cases, the psychologist writes a report, gives it to the court, And that's it. They're never asked to come in and testify. That's such a good point. Yeah, when I was in college, I think like my sophomore year, I did a job shadow with a forensic psychologist, and she's like, I think I go to testify maybe once every 6 months. Most of the time they just took her report at face value. So again, not as exciting as TV shows, but still as impactful, right? If you say this person was completely out of their mind at the time they committed the crime, then that has a lot of implications for how the court proceeds and sort of where that person ends up in the criminal justice system. So yes, the judges will sometimes refuse to let experts testify. They might say, that's not going to help the jury that much. I don't know if you're actually an expert, things along those lines. So there's been a whole series of court cases just about essentially whether or not someone can testify as an expert witness. I mean, or it becomes an issue as part of that case. So in Fry versus the US, which was way back in 1923, which again is why it's hilarious to me that they're like, this is a new field. Like, sure, if 100 years is new, why not? But they argued that to be admissible, testimony must be based on a generally accepted scientific theory. But it didn't specify what generally accepted meant. It didn't specify what was scientific. And it had some negative implications because if you are dealing with a cutting edge methodology, right, or new research findings, then that wouldn't be able to be admitted as evidence until a significant proportion of professionals have seen that and agreed with it. Some states still do use this standard. And in those states, what they call Fry hearings, a separate hearing, are sometimes necessary to determine whether or not the evidence to be presented by an expert witness is acceptable under these standards. Jenkins versus the US, which we mentioned previously, both the American Psychological Association, which is the association for people with PhDs, PsyDs, master's degrees, and the American Psychiatric Association, which is the association for people with MDs who practice psychiatry, wrote opinions. And the DC Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of psychologists. Essentially, the psychiatrists were trying to say, they were worried the psychologists were like honing in on their territory. And they were like, well, they're not MDs, so they're not experts, so they shouldn't be allowed to testify. And the psychologists were like, what? We have as much expertise as you. And so the judge in this case was Judge Bazelon. He was very psychologically minded. And he ruled in favor of the psychologists and said they can testify. And he cited psychologists' extensive training and qualifications for why they should be allowed to be expert witness. Federal Rule of Evidence 702, which was from 1976, was for federal courts. It dealt with the acceptability of a new technique. So it said the technique didn't have to be approved by everyone in the field in order for it to be admissible as evidence and expert testimony. So it basically kind of erased Fry, but only in federal courts. So state and local courts might use different systems. The US Supreme Court has indicated that judges' decisions about the admissibility of expert testimony based on scientific knowledge must be based on the validity of the science in question. So this comes out of the Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals case in 1993. This case was concerning birth defects. So Dow Pharmaceuticals was sued because a medication, a drug that they had on the market, allegedly caused birth defects when pregnant women took it. And the Daubert decision listed 4 factors that judges should consider in assessing whether or not an expert witness testimony should be admissible and whether or not it was valid. So the first was whether the theory or technique they're testifying about can be and has been tested through research. This is often just abbreviated as falsifiability. Can you disprove it in theory through research? The second is whether it has been evaluated through peer review, so has it been published in journals where experts in the field have looked it over. Again, this doesn't mean every single expert in the field has to agree about it. It just means a couple people have to have looked at it and said, yeah, this is valid.
But what I said earlier, like, why did this guy data got like taken out? Why does that have to be peer reviewed?
It was peer reviewed, but again, like when you write up your results, you just present what you present. So like, they, again, now it's more common to actually submit your data as well, but you know, you can see his data, so they had to trust that he was actually being honest. Yeah, I mean, like, as a peer reviewer, you can only review what's given to you, if that makes sense. You have to, just like with our class guidelines, you have to assume this is valid science. Yeah, which makes it tough. And then the third one is the reliability and error rate of the claims. Like, have we seen this over and over? And then, yes, this is consistent. And then 4 is the extent to which the expert's techniques and claims have been generally accepted by the relevant scientific community. There's a little bit of fry still in there. The Supreme Court also decided that this Daubert criteria apply to testimony based on technical or non-scientific knowledge. And this is this Kumho Tire versus Carmichael case. And this was a case, and I think this was before some of you were born, so you might not be as familiar with it. But this was a big deal in the late 90s that tires were failing, particularly on SUVs. And what happens if a tire fails on an SUV is because of their center of balance is so high, they'll often roll. And that's really dangerous, obviously, often a fatal accident. And so the expert who testified used a method of looking at tires that he developed himself. And so they said that the opinion can be based on experience, but that technical experiential evidence has to meet the same criteria as scientific evidence. So basically, if you're a mechanic who works in the field, that's great, but is it just this one thing, or have you looked at it for years, basically? You also might be a policy evaluator, and I would say working in policy is one of the largest growing areas within psychology. So people who are policy evaluators are essentially deciding how well are policies working. So they use their methodological skills to evaluate how well an intervention has worked, for example. So for a while, people tried what they called chemical castration for convicted rapists, which is you have them take medications that make it so they can't get aroused. Does that actually prevent rape in the future, or is that unethical? Ethics here, the policy evaluator has similar ethical responsibilities as the expert witness. So they must report all their results, regardless of whether those are desirable. So like if the government has poured a lot of money into a program and you find this isn't working, and in fact, maybe it's making things worse, you have to tell them that, right? And regardless of possible pressures to interpret your results in a different way. And the standard rules of scientific ethics and research apply here as well. And then forensic evaluators are people who evaluate individuals involved in courts, civil and criminal, and report their findings typically to a judge. And at times, like I said, not that often necessarily, but will be called on to testify in court about their results as well. So as we mentioned previously, competence to stand trial. Is this person right now able to understand what's going on with their trial? If the person is so out of it, they don't understand what's going on, the US Constitution argues that you're not able to assist in their own defense. And therefore, it's not legal or ethical to put them through the trial at that point in time. Might be, we talked about future risk, right? Evaluate the risk of future criminal behavior or violence. evaluate where someone was maybe incapacitated or didn't know the difference between right and wrong at the time of a crime. Those are those not guilty by reason of insanity cases. And evaluate whether or which parents are fit for the custody of a child. And two different ways that you become involved in this is, again, you might be court appointed. If you're someone in the area, you have a practice, the court knows you, they might say, hey, can you do these evals for us? Or you're hired by one of the parties involved. So maybe the court themselves hired you, or one of the attorneys hires you. Or if the plaintiff themselves is rich, they might directly hire you, right? And this is like important to keep in mind is that unfortunately, in a lot of cases, access to this type of evaluation, there's a financial barrier to it, right? So like if forensic psychologists are charging $500 an hour, which their work is work, right? Like we want to pay them what their worth is work is worth, there we go. Then that means that only certain people can afford them, right? And that's really important to think of as well. And then they give their opinions in various different ways. So as we were just talking about, a written report is the most common way. And sometimes if an attorney hired you and you give them your written report, they will say, and it's not the opinion they want to give, they'll say, thanks, but no thanks. And they'll try to find someone else who will agree with their opinion. The other side will typically depose you. So a deposition, you're under oath. You go in, but there's no trier of fact. There's no judge. It's the attorneys present and the court stenographer, and you have to answer questions by the opposing attorney. And then you might have to give that sworn testimony under oath. And this you would do with an attorney, or you might go all the way to the trial where you would offer opinions, provide evidence, like things from your report, be cross-examined by the other side. And again, depending on what type of cases you work in as a forensic psychologist, you might only do this once or twice a year. Typically, you're writing up the report, giving it to the judge. This also means that if you're working as a forensic psychologist, your reports are to be impeccable. No typos, everything very carefully worded, because if you were called to testify about it, the opposing attorney could pick any sentence out of that and question you about it and dig into you about it, right? And so you have to be a really good writer, and be really clear, concise, and precise. Now, in terms of ethics here, they have to comply with ethical codes that apply to psychologists, but there are also those specialty guidelines we talked about previously for forensic psychologists. And if they're specifically doing family courts, there are specific guidelines for child custody evaluations and divorce proceedings. So there's lots of ethical guidelines. So in addition to the report being clear, just in general, the evaluations have to be clear in their purpose. What is the question I'm trying to answer? Am I trying to answer, is this person competent to stand trial, or are they not guilty by reason of insanity? Those are actually two completely different questions that you have to look at in completely different ways. The evaluations have to be conducted by competent individuals. So if you're a forensic psychologist and you're supervising students, you better make sure those students know what they're doing, right? Because if they mess something up, that can blow up in your face. Are respectful of appropriate relationships. You should not try to date someone that you're evaluating or sleep with them. Provide the appropriate level of confidentiality. Now, this is different than if you were a therapy client, right? If someone comes to me and says, hey, hey, the court told me I have to come here for you to evaluate me. My first job as a forensic evaluator is to say, the court is my client, so anything you report here will go to the court, right? If it's relevant. If they tell me they were sexually assaulted and that has nothing to do with what the question is, I don't have to put that in my report, right? And then use methods and procedures that are accurate, current, and consistent with science and the standard practice. So you have to make sure you're up to date on your training for revisions of assessment materials. You're not using something from the 1920s when it was totally unethical to use it now because it was so outdated. And that their results, their findings are communicated appropriately. So again, writing it well, and if you're called to testify, speaking about it well. And depending upon the municipality, sometimes the forensic evaluator may not give an opinion about what's called the ultimate issue. So let's say I'm asked to provide an assessment of whether this person might be incompetent to stand trial. In my report and in my testimony, I can't say this person is clearly incompetent to stand trial. What I have to do is say, this person can't remember things from 5 minutes ago. This person has a really hard time paying attention. This person was talking to voices while we were communicating. But then I can't say, so they're not competent to stand trial, because it's the judge's job to make that decision. So you present the evidence, and you talk about what you know or believe, and you hope that it's clear enough that the judge is like, cool, and goes from there. Now, you can also serve as a consultant in litigation. So trial consultants, for example, are used for things like jury selection. So jury selection is not just 5 random people off the street. There's a whole process you go through where both attorneys get to like reject people and things like that. And so psychologists actually do research on scientific jury selection procedures. They can also conduct community attitude surveys to give an idea of like how juries might go. Like, okay, in the court of public opinion, people are thinking this guy is guilty, right? So that means the attorney has to try that much harder. They can help prepare witnesses to testify. Help them with psychological, if there's someone who's really anxious, for example, you know, working with them on deep breathing, other relaxation techniques. Advise lawyers on their presentation strategies. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll have mock juries come in. So, you know, community members, and the lawyer will present their side, and then the mock jury tells them how convincing it was. And you can do a full mock trial as well. Now, ethics here, this is different than some of the other things we've talked about. Because you are hired by the attorney, your job is to advise the attorney. There is no expectation of impartiality. Your job is to help that person. Psychologists as trial consultants subscribe to the ethical code of attorneys. So the ethical code of the American Bar Association, not to the ethical code of psychologists. So sometimes the principles in these ethics codes become more of an issue. So I have a big chart I'm going to put up, and I have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to adequately cover it. So I'll start class on Tuesday with that. We'll talk about sort of the difference between being a forensic psychologist and being a clinical psychologist. And we'll go from there. All righty. Have a good weekend, and come see me if you have any questions.